This is episode 10, Ethiopia's Tigray War, 2020 to 2022. Please subscribe, like, and share. It helps us reach more people. Africa Wars and Battles Explained, episode 10. Let's begin. In the northern highlands of Ethiopia, where ancient obelisks pierce the horizon and stone churches hide inside rugged mountains, lies the storied land of Tigray. For centuries, its people have carried the memory of a civilization that once shaped trade, religion, and identity in the Horn of Africa. But in the 21st century, this cradle of ancient power became the center of one of the most destructive wars of modern Africa, the Tigray War, fought between 2020 and 2022. To understand how this happened, we must step back into the past, to the world that shaped Tigray's identity long before modern politics and federal constitutions. Part 1. The Deep Roots, Tigray before the modern state. Long before modern borders carved the Horn of Africa into nation-states, the lands of Tigray formed the heart of one of the world's great early civilizations, the Aksumite Empire. From the 1st century AD, Aksum rose as a dominant power, issuing its own coins, commanding Red Sea trade routes, and maintaining diplomatic links that stretched from Rome to India. In the 4th century, under King Ezana, Aksum embraced Christianity, becoming one of the earliest Christian kingdoms in history. The Ge'ez script, still used in Ethiopian Orthodox liturgy today, was refined and preserved here. The region's iconic obelisks, rock-hewn churches, and archaeological wonders all trace their origins to this remarkable era. But as global trade patterns shifted and new coastal powers took control of commerce, Aksum's influence waned. Over the centuries, political authority drifted southward, especially toward regions like Amhara and Shua. Tigrayans were left with two powerful legacies: a proud memory of an ancient empire and a deep-seated sense of marginalization within the Ethiopian state. These intertwined forces, identity and grievance, would echo across generations and shape the political tensions that ultimately erupted into the 2020 war. Part 2. Ethiopia's federal structure, autonomy, power, and Tigray's unique position. To understand how Ethiopia descended into the Tigray War, we must first return to the early 1990s, when the entire structure of the Ethiopian state was redesigned. In 1991, after the fall of Mengistu Haile Mariam's military dictatorship, the victorious rebel coalition known as the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front, EPRDF, seized power. At the heart of this coalition was the Tigray People's Liberation Front, TPLF, the political and military movement that had fought for 17 years in the mountains of Tigray. The architects of the new Ethiopia. Several key figures shaped the future federal system. Mekelle Zenawi, TPLF founder, later prime minister, and the intellectual engine of the new state. Sabhat Nega, ideologue and early strategist of the TPLF. Abate Sihe, Siam Mesfin, and other senior TPLF commanders. Leaders of the Oromo People's Democratic Organization, OPDO, Amhara National Democratic Movement, ANDM, and Southern Ethiopian People's Democratic Movement, SEPDM, all part of the EPRDF coalition. These men, mostly revolutionaries turned statesmen, believed Ethiopia could no longer survive as a centralized empire dominated by a single elite. They had witnessed the consequences: decades of rebellions, ethnic uprisings, and separatist wars. The thinking behind the federal structure. The architects of the new constitution asked a radical question: what if Ethiopia's stability depended not on unity from the center, but on autonomy at the edges? Their answer was the 1995 constitution, written with three major motivations. 1. To prevent another imperial or military dictatorship. After Haile Selassie and the Derg, the TPLF-led coalition feared that a strong centralized state would always be vulnerable to authoritarian takeover. So they dispersed power deliberately down to the regions. 2. To recognize Ethiopia's ethnic diversity as a political reality. The EPRDF leaders believed ethnic groups were the core building blocks of the nation. Thus, Ethiopia became an ethnic federal republic, carved into regional states, kilels, each formed around a dominant ethno-linguistic group. 3. To provide a legal outlet for long-standing historical grievances. By embedding Article 39, the right to self-determination, including secession, into the constitution, the framers sought to ease ethnic tensions by acknowledging the possibility of self-rule, not by forcing unity. It was a bold experiment, a federation where each region controlled its own destiny, at least on paper. Tigray's autonomy, a region with unusual strength. Under this system, Tigray was not just another regional state. Because the TPLF had been the dominant force in the ruling coalition, Tigray used the new federal structure to build strong local institutions. A powerful regional parliament, a well-developed civil service staffed by experienced wartime administrators, extensive local intelligence networks shaped by years of guerrilla warfare, a strong regional economy supported by party-owned conglomerates, local control of taxation, education, and law enforcement, and most significantly, the Tigray Regional Special Forces. Allowed under Ethiopia's constitution, each region could maintain its own heavily armed security force. Tigray took this further, creating one of the best-trained, best-organized regional forces in the country. These forces were not just police, they were well-structured, familiar with Tigray's mountainous terrain, formed by former guerrilla fighters, tactically capable of large-scale military operations. This made Tigray uniquely prepared compared to other regions. A state within a state. For years, Ethiopia functioned with the TPLF at the center of national governance and at the head of a strong Tigray region. But when the balance of power shifted in 2018 with the rise of Abiy Ahmed, everything changed. The TPLF lost national influence. Federal authority shifted toward a more centralized vision. Tigray insisted on maintaining the autonomy guaranteed by the constitution. The power that once kept the federation stable now became a fault line, a region armed with its own special forces, a federal government determined to re-centralize, and a constitution built on the promise of self-rule. This was the structural tension that made conflict not just possible, but perhaps inevitable. Part 3. A region at the crossroads. Geopolitics, rivalries, and international influences. To understand why the Tigray War escalated with such speed, and why outside actors became so deeply entangled, we must examine the geography, rivalries, and strategic ambitions that surround Tigray. For centuries, the region has sat at the intersection of empires and trade routes. In the modern era, it became the intersection of geopolitical fault lines that stretch far beyond Ethiopia's borders. Tigray's strategic geography, a gate to the Red Sea. Tigray is not merely Ethiopia's northernmost region. It is a bridge between the Ethiopian highlands and the Red Sea corridor. Its mountains overlook the road to Asmara, the deserts leading to Sudan, the corridors that historically fed into Massawa and Assab, two of the most strategic ports in the Horn of Africa. Control of Tigray has always meant influence over the northern gateway to Ethiopia and proximity to the shipping lanes that connect Africa, the Middle East, and Europe. This alone made Tigray a strategic flashpoint. But history added gasoline to geography. Eritrea, a long memory and a longer grudge. No external actor shaped the Tigray War more profoundly than Eritrea, a country led since independence by one man, President Isaias Afwerki. A former guerrilla commander and Eritrea's ruler since 1993, Isaias viewed the Tigray People's Liberation Front, the TPLF, not just as a political rival, but as a sworn enemy. From 1991 to 1998, the TPLF-led Ethiopian government and the newly independent Eritrea were uneasy allies. But when war broke out in 1998, everything changed. The Ethiopia-Eritrea War, 1998 to 2000. This conflict, fought over borders, pride, and strategic trade routes, was one of the deadliest wars in modern African history. Although the battlefield stretched along a long frontier, the Eritrean leadership saw the TPLF as the architects of the war, the negotiators of the peace, and the force that imposed the post-war no-war, no-peace stalemate on Eritrea. For 20 years, Isaias Afwerki waited for one moment, the moment when the TPLF would no longer command Ethiopia's central government. That moment came in 2018, when Abiy Ahmed took power and sidelined the TPLF from national leadership. Isaias saw an opening. And when conflict erupted in Tigray in November 2020, Eritrea intervened rapidly, decisively, and with a clear motive, to destroy the TPLF once and for all. Eritrean troops crossed the border within days, fighting alongside Ethiopia's federal army and Amhara regional forces. Their involvement transformed a federal dispute into a regional war. Sudan, a neighbor with its own stakes. To the west, Sudan watched the conflict with deep concern and deep suspicion. Sudan had its own disputes with Ethiopia over fertile borderlands like Al-Fashaga, areas claimed by both Amhara farmers and Sudanese communities. The collapse of Ethiopian stability threatened to push refugees into Sudan and upset the fragile political transition taking place in Khartoum after the fall of President Omar al-Bashir. By 2021, over 70,000 Tigrayan refugees had crossed the border into eastern Sudan, prompting fears of a spillover conflict. Sudan's military leadership saw Ethiopia's internal turmoil as both a humanitarian burden and a potential geopolitical opportunity, shifting power dynamics along one of Africa's most sensitive borders. The Gulf states, Red Sea ambitions, and proxy influence. The rise of Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Qatar as major power brokers in the Horn of Africa added a new layer to the conflict's geopolitical landscape. The UAE had previously supplied drones to Ethiopia during conflicts outside Tigray. Gulf states viewed Ethiopia as a key partner in maintaining stability or shaping outcomes across the Red Sea. The war in Tigray threatened to destabilize the entire region, prompting quiet diplomacy and competing strategic calculations behind the scenes. Global powers, the US, the EU, and China. Beyond the region, world powers watched Tigray with deep concern. The United States feared a humanitarian catastrophe. Worried about instability in the Horn of Africa, where U.S. counterterrorism operations depend on regional cooperation. Pushed for ceasefires and humanitarian access. The European Union suspended budget support. Pressured Ethiopia diplomatically. Raised alarms about human rights violations. China took a quieter approach, given its major infrastructure investments and preference for non-interference. Focused on stability to protect its economic interests. Each global actor saw Tigray not only as a humanitarian crisis, but as a potential disruptor in a region central to international shipping and global security. A region where local conflict meets global stakes. Tigray's war was not simply a domestic Ethiopian dispute. It was a conflict fought on a landscape where ancient rivalries, modern alliances, Red Sea geopolitics, border disputes, and global strategic interests all collided in a single region barely the size of Portugal. The intersection of these forces made the Tigray War one of the most geopolitically complex conflicts in 21st century Africa, where every battle, every advance, and every retreat sent ripples across the Horn of Africa and beyond. Part 4. The Build-Up to War. Ethiopia Reimagined. By 2018, Ethiopia stood at a breaking point. 3 years of nationwide protests had shaken the political establishment to its core. Young people were in the streets demanding justice. Ethnic regions called for greater autonomy, and the old ruling coalition, the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front, EPRDF, dominated for decades by the Tigray People's Liberation Front, TPLF, found itself losing credibility and grip. The government tried crackdowns. It tried reshuffles. Nothing worked. The country needed a new face. Inside the EPRDF, pressure mounted to pick a leader who could calm the streets, stop the unrest, and keep Ethiopia from descending into chaos. The TPLF, though still powerful, no longer commanded the obedience or fear it once did. Years of centralized control, corruption allegations, and heavy-handed security measures had built resentment, particularly among the Oromo and Amhara communities. Then came a turning point. In early 2018, Prime Minister Hailemariam Desalegn resigned, an unprecedented move in modern Ethiopian politics. His resignation forced the ruling coalition to choose a successor. And for the first time in decades, the decision did not automatically favor Tigray's political elite. Behind closed doors, EPRDF leaders debated fiercely. The TPLF wanted continuity. The country wanted change. Abiy Ahmed, an Oromo politician from the Oromo People's Democratic Organization, OPDO, emerged as the unexpected frontrunner. He was young, articulate, and, most importantly, not associated with the old guard. Within the coalition, the arithmetic had shifted. The Oromo faction wanted leadership that represented Ethiopia's largest ethnic group. The Amhara faction supported a reformist figure. The smaller parties saw Abiy as a stabilizing compromise, and the TPLF, deeply unpopular nationwide, no longer had the political capital to impose its choice. In March 2018, the coalition voted. Abiy Ahmed won decisively. And just like that, after nearly 3 decades of TPLF dominance, the center of power moved away from Tigray. To millions across the country, Abiy became a symbol of renewal. He released political prisoners. He welcomed exiled opposition groups home. He promised democratic elections. And in a dramatic diplomatic move, he signed peace with Eritrea in 2018, ending 2 decades of hostility. The world took notice. Abiy was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. Ethiopia became the story of an African renaissance. But in the Northern Highlands, the mood was starkly different. For the TPLF, this wasn't reform. It was dismantling. Dismantling their influence over the military and intelligence services. Dismantling the ethnic federal system they had built after overthrowing the Derg. Dismantling the political architecture that ensured Tigray a decisive voice in Ethiopia's future. Tensions grew rapidly. By 2020, the fracture became irreparable. As COVID-19 swept across the world, Ethiopia postponed national elections. Most political factions accepted the delay. The TPLF did not. They accused Abiy's government of using the pandemic to cling to power and held their own regional election in September, a direct challenge to federal authority. Abiy retaliated by cutting federal funding to Tigray. Mekelle, in return, declared Addis Ababa illegitimate. The rhetoric hardened. The mistrust deepened. Ethiopia's political fault lines widened with every passing week. Then came the night of November 3, 2020. Explosions, gunfire, and chaos erupted across Tigray as the federal government accused the TPLF of launching a coordinated attack on the Northern Command, one of Ethiopia's largest, most sophisticated military bases, with tens of thousands of soldiers. The TPLF insisted the attack was preemptive, claiming federal forces were preparing an offensive of their own. Within hours, the debate no longer mattered. Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed addressed the nation in a somber, controlled tone and declared what many feared. Ethiopia is now engaged in a law enforcement operation. It was, in reality, full-scale war. A war rooted in old resentments, shifting alliances, competing visions, and decades of uneasy coexistence. A war that would burn across the Horn of Africa, redraw political realities, and unleash a humanitarian catastrophe that the world would struggle to comprehend. Part 5. The War, Alliances, Weaponry, and the Descent into Catastrophe. When the war began in November 2020, Ethiopia did not plunge into a simple confrontation between the federal government and a rebellious region. It unraveled into one of the most complex and militarized conflicts in modern African history, drawing in armies, regional militias, foreign governments, and an arsenal of weaponry rarely seen in the Horn of Africa. From the very first days, alliances began to crystallize. The Federal Coalition, an unlikely wartime alliance. The Ethiopian National Defense Force, ENDF, one of Africa's largest standing armies, formed the backbone of the federal offensive. But the ENDF was stretched thin. Many of its Northern Command units were compromised, defected, or captured in the opening clashes. Reinforcements poured in from across the country. Amhara regional forces, including local militias and heavily armed special units, joined the war with their own motivations. For Amhara leaders, the conflict was not just about federal authority. It was about reclaiming lands in western and southern Tigray, territories they believed belonged historically to the Amhara region. From the north came the most decisive addition, the Eritrean Defense Forces, EDF. For Eritrea's president, Isaias Afwerki, this war was decades in the making. The TPLF had been Eritrea's bitter enemy since the 1998 to 2000 border war. Now, with Ethiopia under new leadership, Eritrea saw a chance to settle old scores. Within days, Eritrean troops crossed the border, opening a second front with devastating force. As the conflict dragged on, the federal side gained another critical advantage: drones. A coalition of foreign suppliers, Turkey, Iran, and the United Arab Emirates, began providing armed drones, turning Ethiopia into one of the most drone-dependent battlefields in African history. These drones would later reshape the war, delivering precision strikes that reversed major Tigrayan advances. Tigray's resistance, a region transformed into an army. On the other side stood a region fighting for its survival. The Tigray Regional Special Forces, already well-trained and equipped before the war, formed the core of the initial defense. They were quickly joined by local militias, veteran officers from the Ethiopian Northern Command who defected, and a rapidly expanding army of volunteers and guerrilla fighters, young and old. This force soon reorganized into what became known as the Tigray Defense Forces, TDF. More than a military, it became a mass mobilization. An entire society turned into a wartime machine. Farmers, civil servants, teachers, and students lined up for training. Commanders who had decades of experience from Ethiopia's past wars emerged from retirement to lead the fight. Their weapons came largely from the dramatic events of the war's first 72 hours: captured bases, seized armories, and vehicles taken from the Northern Command. The TDF turned Ethiopia's own firepower against it. The weaponry, modern machines of war meet ancient battlegrounds. This was no ordinary conflict. Ethiopia's Tigray War introduced weapons and tactics more commonly seen in Middle Eastern conflicts than in East Africa. Federal and Eritrean forces deployed Bayraktar TB2, Mohajer 6, and wing-long drones, 122mm and 152mm heavy artillery, Soviet-era tanks, including Type 59s and T-72s, BM-21 Grad rocket systems capable of leveling entire neighborhoods, helicopter gunships and fighter aircraft, striking deep into Tigrayan territory, heavy machine guns and long-range missile systems. For the TDF, the arsenal was more improvised but no less deadly. Assault rifles and machine guns seized from federal bases, RPG-7s and anti-armor weapons, DSHK and PKM heavy machine guns, captured armored vehicles during the chaotic early days, homemade explosives, landmines, and booby traps, highly mobile guerrilla units, using the mountains as both shield and fortress. A war that mutated. What began as a swift federal operation soon collapsed into a brutal, grinding conflict. Ethiopian and Eritrean mechanized units pushed deep into Tigray, capturing towns and cities. But once the TDF fell back into the mountains, their ancestral battleground, the war changed shape. Mechanized warfare gave way to ambushes, night raids, hit-and-run attacks, and block-by-block resistance. Drones hunted from the sky. Guerrilla fighters countered from the shadows. The war stretched into towns, villages, farms, churches, and marketplaces. Lines blurred. Civilians were trapped in the middle. This was no longer a political dispute. It had become a catastrophic battle of survival, one that would devastate communities, redraw alliances, and shock the world with its scale and brutality. The descent had begun. Part 6. The Humanitarian Darkness, the Toll of the War. As the war raged across Tigray and the surrounding regions, the battlefield expanded far beyond military targets. Towns, villages, farms, and sacred spaces became engulfed in a wave of destruction that few alive had ever imagined. With communications severed and media blocked from entering, a blackout descended, one that concealed unimaginable suffering. For months, the only accounts that escaped the region came from survivors who fled on foot, aid workers who witnessed the aftermath, and digital evidence pieced together by investigators. From these scattered fragments, a devastating picture emerged. Killings and massacres, cities silenced by violence. Across Tigray, violence swept through communities with terrifying speed. Independent investigations later documented mass killings in Aksum, Mekelle, Adwa, Humera, Shiraro, Zalambesa, and a dozen smaller towns whose names seldom reached the international headlines. Some communities lost entire families in a single day. Civilians described house-to-house executions, bodies lining streets for days, indiscriminate shelling of markets and neighborhoods, killings carried out along ethnic lines. In Aksum, one of Africa's most ancient cities, witnesses reported massacres so extensive that survivors buried victims in mass graves dug by hand. In other towns, people vanished without a trace as security forces and militias swept through villages. With communications blocked, families had no way to call for help or to know whether loved ones were still alive. Sexual violence, a weapon of terror. As international investigators gained access to survivors, another horror surfaced: the systematic use of sexual violence as a tool of war. Women and girls, some as young as 12, described being assaulted by soldiers from multiple forces. Survivors reported gang rape by groups of fighters, rape accompanied by ethnic slurs, captivity and sexual slavery, intentional mutilation. Doctors in makeshift clinics told of women arriving with injuries too severe to treat. Many survivors said the violence was not random, but a deliberate weapon meant to shatter families, traumatize communities, and break resistance. Displacement, a people scattered. The war triggered one of the largest internal displacements in modern African history. More than 2.5 million people were forced to flee their homes inside Ethiopia. Tens of thousands crossed into Sudan, walking for days without food or water. Entire villages in western and northern Tigray were emptied overnight. Families moved from shelter to shelter, often sleeping in schools, abandoned buildings, and open fields. Mothers carried children on their backs. The elderly were pushed in wheelbarrows. Many fled with nothing but the clothes they wore. Famine and hunger, starvation as a battlefield. As the conflict dragged on, food became a weapon. Roads were blocked, warehouses looted, crops destroyed, banking and communication shut down. Aid convoys, lifelines in a region dependent on humanitarian support, were halted, diverted, or attacked. Farmers were unable to plant or harvest. Livestock starved, wandered, or were stolen. By mid-2021, humanitarian agencies warned that hundreds of thousands were on the brink of starvation. Parts of Tigray slipped into famine-like conditions, with aid workers describing scenes reminiscent of Ethiopia's famine in the 1980s. Parents mixed leaves with water to feed their children. Hospitals ran out of medicine. Newborn babies died from hunger in clinics that had no food to offer grieving mothers. Economic and cultural destruction, a society unmade. The war did not spare Ethiopia's heritage. Historic churches and monasteries, some over 1,000 years old, were damaged or looted. Businesses, factories, and markets were burned or stripped bare. Schools and universities closed. Hospitals were destroyed, occupied, or looted of equipment. Roads, bridges, and communication lines collapsed or were deliberately targeted. The economic foundations of Tigray, its farms, industries, and institutions, were shattered. The region, once considered one of Ethiopia's most politically organized, was left in ruins. By 2022, the humanitarian map was bleak. The war had created one of the world's worst humanitarian crises. Aid groups described the situation as apocalyptic, catastrophic, and a war fought in darkness. What began as a political dispute had spiraled into mass trauma. Cities were emptied. Families were shattered. An entire generation bore scars, physical, psychological, and historical, that would echo for decades. In the heart of the Horn of Africa, a humanitarian darkness had unfolded, largely unseen. Part 7. The Turn of the Tide and the Road to the Pretoria Agreement. By mid-2021, after months of siege, airstrikes, and a multi-front assault, many believed the Tigray Defense Forces, TDF, were on the verge of collapse. But in the shadows of the mountains, in the caves, forests, and villages of Tigray, a different story was unfolding. Commanders reorganized. Fighters who had once been farmers, teachers, doctors, and students reshaped themselves into a disciplined guerrilla force. And then, seemingly out of nowhere, came the reversal. The counteroffensive, a stunning turn. In June 2021, the TDF launched a surprise counteroffensive that shocked observers across the world. Federal soldiers withdrew. Armored vehicles abandoned roadsides. Within days, the TDF retook Mekelle, the regional capital, a symbolic and strategic victory. Momentum surged. Tigrayan forces pushed south into Amhara and east into Afar, moving with remarkable speed. For months, they captured town after town, inching toward the main highway that led to Addis Ababa. By late 2021, TDF units were within roughly 300 kilometers of the capital. For a brief moment, Ethiopia stood at the edge of a historical rupture. Rumors of an assault on Addis Ababa spread online. Diplomats evacuated. Foreign governments issued calls for restraint. The world feared that Africa's second most populous nation was sliding toward state collapse. The federal response: drones, reinforcements, and a renewed offensive. But the momentum would not last. By early 2022, Ethiopia's federal government launched a renewed series of offensives, this time with critical technological superiority. Drones from Turkey, Iran, and the UAE hammered TDF convoys, hitting supply lines and leadership positions with deadly precision. At the same time, the Ethiopian National Defense Force regrouped. Amhara militias mobilized in large numbers. Eritrean troops surged back into northern Tigray, opening a new front with devastating force. The combination proved overwhelming. Tigrayan positions collapsed in multiple directions. Key towns, including Shire, Ottawa, and Aksum, fell back under federal and Eritrean control. Desperate, surrounded, and cut off from supplies, the TDF retreated into the mountains once more. Both sides had reached their limits. A country on the brink. By late 2022, Ethiopia was exhausted. Across the country, the economy strained under the weight of war. Millions were displaced and starving. Eritrean forces remained deeply involved. The political fabric seemed ready to tear. Diplomats warned of a worst-case scenario, the complete fragmentation of Ethiopia, a crisis that could destabilize the entire Horn of Africa. It was in this moment, when military victory seemed impossible for either side, that negotiations finally found space to breathe. The Pretoria Agreement, a fragile peace. In October 2022, representatives of the federal government and the TPLF were flown to South Africa for mediated talks. After days of tense negotiations, on November 2, 2022, the two sides signed what would become known as the Pretoria Agreement. The terms were stark but necessary. The TPLF agreed to disarm heavy weapons, reintegrate fighters through a monitored process, recognize federal authority. The federal government agreed to restore electricity, banking, and communication, reopen humanitarian corridors, halt hostilities, and allow aid into Tigray. For the first time in 2 years, the guns fell silent. But even as signatures dried on the pages, everyone understood one truth. Peace on paper could not erase the wounds carved into communities, families, and the land itself. The Pretoria Agreement marked the end of open warfare, but it was only the beginning of the long journey toward healing, rebuilding, and reckoning with the shadow the war had cast across Ethiopia and the Horn of Africa. Part 8. Aftermath. Wounds that still bleed. Tigray emerged from the war shattered on every front. Its political institutions were weakened, its economy stripped bare, its cities and villages scarred by the destruction of infrastructure, and its people carrying invisible wounds that may take generations to heal. The true death toll remains a matter of dispute, but most credible estimates place it in the hundreds of thousands. Lives lost not only through direct violence, but also through starvation, disease, and the collapse of health services. Entire communities now live with a deep sense of mistrust. Families search for loved ones who never returned. Newly discovered mass graves continue to reveal the scale of the tragedy. A region once celebrated for its obelisks, ancient churches carved into mountains, and the proud legacy of the Aksumite civilization now finds itself defined by the memory of one of the darkest and deadliest conflicts of the 21st century. The impact of Ethiopia's Tigray War, casualties, displacement, and the human cost. In the quiet valleys and mountain plateaus of northern Ethiopia, where farmers once tilled the land in the rhythm of the seasons, a humanitarian catastrophe unfolded, silent, vast, and almost unimaginable in scale. The Tigray War, fought between 2020 and 2022, did not simply redraw political lines. It tore through families, communities, and generations. Its impact will echo for decades. Casualties, a war hidden from the world. For much of the conflict, Tigray was cut off, its internet shut down, its roads blocked, its journalists barred. But when the world finally gained glimpses of what happened, the numbers were staggering. Researchers estimate between 300,000 and 600,000 people may have died as a result of fighting, starvation, and lack of medical care. Some estimates rise even higher, calling it one of the deadliest wars of the 21st century. Entire towns saw their populations decimated. Hospitals collapsed under shortages, operating without anesthesia. In some areas, the dead could not be buried for days. Displacement, a people scattered. More than 2.5 to 3 million people were forced to flee their homes. Families walked for days, sometimes weeks, carrying only what they could hold. Many crossed into Sudan, Others crowded into makeshift shelters inside Tigray, Amhara, and Afar. Villages emptied. Farmland was abandoned. Children were separated from parents in the chaos of flight. Camps became cities of loss, places where people waited for food that often never arrived. Famine and starvation. Blocks on food, fuel, and medicine created what humanitarian agencies called a man-made famine. Up to 5.4 million people, almost the entire population of Tigray, were placed under emergency levels of food insecurity. Fields were burned, crops looted, livestock slaughtered. Humanitarian trucks were stopped or refused passage. Pregnant women walked kilometers to find medicine that no longer existed. Wartime sexual violence, a weapon of humiliation. Across the conflict, rape was weaponized. Survivors described assaults committed by multiple armies, Ethiopian, Eritrean, Amhara militia, and in some cases, by Tigrayan fighters as well. Women and girls spoke of attacks carried out to break families, punish communities, and erase identity. Doctors treated survivors who had been assaulted with extreme brutality. Some returned with lifelong injuries. Others never returned at all. UN investigators called it systematic, widespread, and cruel. Destruction of infrastructure, a region pushed into darkness. Electricity cut, banks frozen, telecommunications severed. Tigray descended into a blackout where not even a phone call could reach the outside world. Hospitals were stripped of equipment, schools destroyed, factories looted. Churches and mosques, some centuries old, were damaged or defiled. Ancient manuscripts disappeared. A civilization that traced its roots to Aksum found its historical treasures placed in jeopardy. Child soldiers and traumatized generations. Both major sides were accused of using or forcibly recruiting youth. Children orphaned by the war grew up in displacement camps. Some saw their parents killed. Others learned to navigate life amid hunger and fear. Psychologists warn that Tigray's next generation will carry invisible wounds, trauma that will shape their future and the region's stability. Regional tensions and lasting divisions. The war deepened ethnic mistrust across Ethiopia. Amhara, Tigrayan, Afar, and other communities emerged more polarized than before. Families remained divided by blockade lines, arrest campaigns, and forced relocation. Many of the displaced cannot return, either because their homes were destroyed or because the territories they fled are now controlled by different forces. The human cost, beyond numbers. Behind every statistic lies a story. A mother who lost her child to hunger. A father who buried his son during a communications blackout. A young girl who will live her life with the scars of wartime assault. A city like Mekelle, once bustling with students and traders, now marked by the shadows of war. The Tigray War was not only a clash of armies. It was a conflict that shattered the human fabric of a people. Reflection. When the guns finally fell silent in late 2022, the war did not end. Its ghosts remain in empty farmlands, rebuilt graves, and the eyes of displaced families searching for home. Reconstruction will take years. Healing may take longer. And for many, the memories of the Tigray War will forever divide the world into two eras, before the war and after it. The Tigray War did not begin with a single attack, and it did not end with a single agreement. It is the result of centuries of identity, decades of political power struggles, and a fragile federal system pushed to its limits. From ancient empires to modern drone warfare. From constitutional autonomy to devastating famine. From a proud region to a wounded people. The story of Tigray is a reminder that history is never truly past. It lives in memories, borders, and battles, shaping the present and influencing the future. And in Tigray, ancient, resilient, and scarred, the struggle for identity and survival continues. Thank you so much for watching. Please subscribe, like, and share. It helps us reach more people.